It's interesting. I think the conversation around social media's negative impact on mental health has been, in one way, beat up to ad nauseum. On the second hand, nothing has been done about it. So I would argue maybe we're not beating it up the right way or to the right people, but like it almost is becoming cliche when people say, yeah, social media is bad for kids, and oh my gosh, I'm so blessed I was raised without it. What am I going to do with my own 4 kids and their social media? But it's not gotten, I don't think there's any more parameters now than there were 5 years ago. And there is now starting to become better data to show, yeah, this is actually pretty toxic. Now there's beautiful things. I wouldn't know you. I wouldn't know a lot of people. I wouldn't be able to stay connected. Man, there's some really beautiful things about it. But like all things, if they're brought to their extreme point, it can get corrupted and get toxic.
All right, guys, welcome back to a brand new episode of the Hart Hustle podcast. Now, today's going to be an incredibly important conversation because I'm sitting across this digital table, if you will, with Matt Simon, the COO of New Hope. Today's conversation is going to be talking about not only New Hope's mission, combating youth mental health crisis and the contributing factors. We're going to talk about mental health advocacy. We're going to talk about leadership and so much more, man. Matt, welcome to the show.
Keenan, good to see you, man. Thank you.
Absolutely. So in our previous conversation, Matt, you said something very succinct to me. You said, I've always been called to supporting family and children who are on the margins. Why are you called to serve that specific population of people?
I have no idea why. But I think it's because I find it incredibly fun and exhilarating. And I think if you find something fun that other people would find terrible, that's probably like your calling. And as from a young age, the only thing I think I was good at that also filled me up, I think there was things I was good at that didn't fill me up, but the thing I was good at that filled me up simultaneously was just working with people and working with kids and working with families. I came up through the Young Life system. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that it's kind of a high school outreach nonprofit. And there's a time in my life where I was probably going to kind of turn left and had somebody help me not turn left and stay straight. And that just revealed to me that, like, man, relationships are powerful at certain times, particularly, again, adult relationships with young people at critical times just is everything. And that person, I still know him. He's such a huge part of my story. And he wasn't the coolest or the funniest or the smartest or the most athletic. He just like cared about me. And I was like, okay, if that's the price of admission for doing something awesome, I could probably do that.
Do you remember the first time where you figured out that working with people and investing your time and energy into helping people become the best version of themselves was that thing that filled you up? Was there like an aha moment that you had?
I was like a senior in high school when I started to like mentor some freshmen and sophomores. And that was incredibly rewarding. And then I was able to get some opportunities to actually lead some mission trips overseas, like to Romania and things like that. And I look back on that. I was probably doing that when I was like 19, and I was leading groups of like 30 people, and I had no business doing that. Like, clearly that church had no legal arm because that was a really bad call. But so some of that, just like, leading people and galvanizing people and getting people excited, that has felt right from a very young age. And then when I got kind of serendipitously turned into the therapy world as opposed to kind of the ministry world, that instantly felt right. And when somebody exposed to me kind of some of the theories and some kind of like the actual psychology behind family systems work and why working with the whole family, like that just clicked so instantly. It was kind of like, oh, I've been searching for this all along. I didn't even know I was looking for it. So there was a conversation that was like a lights on kind of moment. And it was really about family therapy and the importance of, if you want to intervene in a kid's life, you also have to intervene in a family's life. And that seems simple, but in a lot of areas, it's still kind of not the norm, unfortunately.
I mean, that's something I experienced quite early in my life. I had those moments of realization where when I look back on some of the behavior of my family, two sides, my father's black, my mother's white, both from Eastern Washington, I saw how the different sides of the fence, if you will, handled things like conversations about mental wellness, mental health, family, addiction, XYZ, completely different. And as I got a little bit older, I started to recognize that we often are systems and products of our family system. And if we don't have a solid household, we're not going to have a solid foundation in which we can build relationships, navigate troubling times and things like that. Whereas your early life pretty stable from that perspective?
Yeah, that's it's interesting. I mean, a lot of people that get into like the helping profession, and a lot of my peers who are some of the best therapists, and they're kind of helpers because they can personally attest to like the hurt and some of that stuff, and they wanted to go on and be a help. I really don't have that kind of story, although I think my story still has allowed me to have a really powerful impact in a different way. But yeah, I was incredibly blessed, incredibly lucky, incredibly fortunate, incredibly privileged, like whatever the word is. My parents were awesome. I had a safe and stable home. I always say, like, I'm of the generation that we're like the last generation to know like what dial-up internet was. And so life was just I'm not old, I'm not young, but like life was still a little bit slow enough. We could go out in the neighborhood and stay out until dark. And so I was very, very lucky there. Very sheltered in a lot of ways though. And that, some of those bubbles got popped at different times in my life. But some of the things that I truly believe is there is a true universal human experience that we all go through, and I think there's universal human kind of yearnings and longings, particularly in young people, and that it doesn't matter if you're from Washington or Iran. I do think there's a universality to that. And the things that I have had in my life, both the trials and the tribulations, I think through those I can relate to anybody. I can't necessarily say I've walked your exact shoes, but I know what loss is, and I know what hardship is, and I know what it feels like to want something and not get it. I know what it feels like to want somebody's affection and not get it, So yeah, it's interesting. So on paper, I had an incredibly blessed life, but everybody's life is full of curveballs. And I think if you're naturally kind of like an empathetic person, it's not that hard I've never felt like I needed to go through something exactly to serve that person in some kind of a helping context.
It's interesting when we have a heart for helping others, and we also recognize the spaces that we participate in from a professional world perspective, right? Let's get a little business tactical.
Sure.
The total addressable market in a space like mental, behavioral health, community services, the helping fields are growing every single year. Why do you think we're seeing such a catalyst in this space growing, although that might not be the best thing for our society?
Yeah, man, I don't know how long we have. That's a 6-day, that's a Joe Rogan podcast, like right there. Cause I do, and again, some of these, and I'd love, if I say anything on here that somebody's like, man, I want to challenge that, I'd love to talk to that person. Cause again, I love to engage and I love to be wrong. I'm wrong often, but as a mental health person, as a mental health professional, as somebody who spent a good part of my career, and I work kind of in the Bible Belt South, and so a lot of the clients I worked with when I was doing a lot of direct therapy were from backgrounds that were, very religious, as predominantly African American families in kind of urban area Charlotte, and so there was a lot of like having to break through stigma and shame, and what does this mean for my family story, and what does it mean if my great uncle sexually abused me, but I still need to respect my elders? Like all of those layers were navigated. And so I spent a lot of time like feeling proud when people would be okay with their mental health for the first like 10 years of my career. And now the last like few years, I've struggled with some of the societal kind of shifts where now it's like everybody has to have a diagnosis. And it feels a little like we're trying to one-upsmanship each other on some of this stuff. And then I do think there's a capital commercial agenda that then gets mapped onto that in ways that just feel uncomfortable. I don't quite know how to explain it. I mean, I think it works on individual, community, and like society levels. I think it's too early to know if it's a net positive or a net negative. like the post-COVID mental health boom, which is it really more mental health, or is it that we're talking about it more? Is it kind of, this chicken and egg conversation? Smarter people probably can debate that more than me. I get a little worried it could be a net negative though, overall, especially when it comes to kids, especially when it comes to pathologizing kids at a younger and younger age for things that I think are kind of just human experiences. And most of our diagnosis should just be kind of a messed up but pretty good human who's making their way through. Like if there was a diagnosis there, I would have probably given 90% of my clients that. But insurance doesn't pay for that diagnosis, and sometimes treatment doesn't get had unless they have a diagnosis. So there's a lot of tricky things in there.
It really is tough because yes, we are having a conversation more so ever now than ever, which is a beautiful thing. But the other thing is like the experience that we all went through during the pandemic of experiencing extreme feelings of grief and loss in our personal lives by losing family members, but also the grief and loss from our professional lives, the sense of normalcy, the routine, the community, the office setting. So much of our identity was tied up in that, and then it was taken away from us. And it seems like we're still dealing with those feelings of grief and loss. And although you and I came from a slower time, right, when we had dial-up internet and there wasn't as much pressure, now there are so many different catalysts and so many different, I would say, elements that are being thrust into people's lives by these little devices, by the connectivity that we have to everywhere, that compounds this conversation, which has to be an incredibly difficult spot for you guys to sit in as mental health professionals serving the community.
Yeah, I mean, things are moving so fast. Phenomenons are happening so fast, particularly amongst teenagers. It's really hard to know what is a fad versus what is a true developmental phenomenon versus what's just a coping skill versus what's a this and what's a that. And again, I think this has been beat up at. It's interesting. I think the conversation around social media's negative impact on mental health has been, in one way, beat up to ad nauseum. On the second half, nothing has been done about it. So I would argue maybe we're not beating it up the right way or to the right people, but like it almost is becoming cliche when people say, yeah, social media is bad for kids, and oh my gosh, I'm so blessed I was raised without it. What am I going to do with my own 4 kids and their social media? But it's not gotten, I don't think there's any more parameters now than there were 5 years ago. And there is now starting to become better data to show, yeah, this is actually pretty toxic. Now there's beautiful things. I wouldn't know you. I wouldn't know a lot of people. I wouldn't be able to stay connected. Man, there's some really beautiful things about it. But like all things, if they're brought to their extreme point, it can get corrupted and get toxic. And then obviously kids just naturally mess things up. They naturally kind of abuse things because they don't have brakes yet. They're just driving 100 miles an hour in whatever direction. They developmentally don't have brakes yet. So yeah, we deal with that a lot. We can unpack that, but yeah, we are at the intersection of a lot. I would say we are at the intersection of a lot of these kind of societal things, and New Hope is kind of right at that intersection. And it's good. In some ways it's like, okay, well, let's meet this moment, and this is why we're here, and this is why I was called to do this. And on the second half, I'm trying to figure out, well, how do we make any of this better on a macro level? Because New Hope growing in some ways is like a symptom of something going wrong somewhere upstream.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what's interesting about these spaces is we continue to see them explode. Like you said, there's societal factors and economic injection, so we can help these spaces grow to be able to meet the demand. But when we have the incentives that are tied to diagnosis, means that we have a reimbursement CPT code that we can then push through the books to be reimbursed from Medicaid or Medicare or private insurance. It creates a system, a feedback loop that often isn't the best for our society. It's like we change the incentives, we change the outcome. And it seems like we're just kind of caught in a weird space and time right now.
Yes, no, we definitely are. And we're always late, we're always behind. I mean, that's one of the tricky things with things moving so fast and our attention spans getting so slow is like, we don't even have time to study stuff before the next thing. We didn't get done studying the last thing before the next thing is right in front of our face. And you can't just bury your head, like at least in a place like New Hope, we can't bury our head in the sand of like academia and say, well, let me study this before I take this next kid. It's like we have kids banging down our door, and if they don't come to us, they're going to be sleeping that night in a hospital or in a shelter. And I know we're better than that. Setting. So there's a lot of times where I'll tell my team, when I have to wear both kind of a clinical hat and a COO hat. but I do say, listen, like we're going to do the best we can with what we got, and we're going to inject a whole bunch of common sense and a whole bunch of trauma informed care and a whole bunch of just let's help this kid have a good day. And somewhere in that, maybe we'll get to a good outcome, even if it's not one that would stand up to academic rigor or something.
It's interesting because I often think about, my generation. I'm going to kind of segue here a little bit. I was born in 90. I came up, and a lot of the flack that I got as being a teenager, younger individual was, you guys are part of the 8th place trophy generation, the participation trophy generation, right?
Yeah.
And my question to that as I got a little bit older and had a little bit more awareness was, hold on. We've been getting a whole bunch of flack for being that generation, but who was the one who bought us the participation trophies? It wasn't me who went to the trophy store and said, we need a 7th and 8th place trophy. So how much of the accountability for problems like we're facing right now go back to the responsibility of the home and for mom and dad to be able to have honest, true, often tough conversations with their kids about the role of social media and mental health and everything else that comes along with that?
Yeah. I think one of the best books that anybody can read from 2020 to 2024 that's been out, literally of all the books published, one of the best books bar none is The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt. I'm not sure if you read that, but
I have not.
He's I don't want to butcher it, but he's kind of a sociologist and like an anthropologist of culture and movements and people. And just that title basically says like, what is this kind of softening? And it's really about like, what's this anxiety boom so much about? Why are so many people being like, how are we more anxious in 2024 than people living in like Rome? Rome seemed like a pretty anxious, like I would have been pretty anxious to live in Rome if I could get thrown in the Colosseum. Here, I have more anxiety about my iPhone update and like statistically, it's not perceived anxiety. It's like real anxiety. And so something is happening. We are becoming, less resilient, not more. And he ties a lot of that back to shifts in parenting, which does tie back a little bit though to shifts in, and this is nothing I really say is political because I'm not smart enough to be political, but even shifts in, we were having a conversation on our podcast with like a 25-year veteran of a child welfare system in Charlotte. And he came from, I think, Maryland, and they came down to Charlotte. He was talking about, again, the change in neighborhoods, like how neighborhoods used to be structured, and they went from kind of blocks and grids where everybody looked after each other to these silos where it's just a bunch of islands, where now literally you can't walk anywhere, like nobody even takes the bus to school. And these things are creating these little, little kind of like bubbles amongst bubbles. And so like the family's in a bubble, and then you got a neighborhood in a bubble. You have no community anymore. People drive straight into their, I wonder how much of this is tied to garage doors being able to have an automatic beeper, because as people come home, they're going in, they're not even saying hi to their neighbors anymore. Whereas we used to have to get out and maybe like lug that thing up and say hi to Johnny down the street. All of that stuff, I think, does add up to a lack of resilience and kind of a softening of everybody. Because it's not that the world is actually getting harder. There's really no data to show that the world is getting harder or more dangerous. Actually, all the data is showing that it's going in the opposite direction. And yet we're kind of like internally suffering more. So he has some really interesting stuff in there about societal shifts that led to that. And then parental shifts. And then again, I think the social media influence on the parent generation that just got into the Facebook world in the early 2000s. And again, I don't want to pick on moms, but I think the Facebook mom generation, where you are only posting the good, you're not allowed to post the bad, you're only posting the positive images, and then there's a competition level to that. It does create a lot of anxiety. And I think anxiety absolutely flows downstream. There's a lot of, at some point, some generation of parents has to collectively agree. My wife and I talk about this all the time. No, we're not going to do that anymore. No, we are not going to do that. Even though it's the easier thing to do, we do it a lot. But you just catch yourself doing stuff. And then her and I will be like, do you think our parents would have ever, put our kids' plate back in the sink for them? And again, these aren't like, I wasn't raised in the 60s. This is like the 90s, like this is the 90s. And again, it's become some of default. I think we move so fast. There's probably 50 reasons for it, but the result is kids are getting more entitled, less resilient, more anxious, and I think less ready to handle the world, which that's a parent's only job. Get your kid ready to handle the world. The last thing I'll say on that coddling of the American mind, the best quote I have from him that I just think summarizes the whole book. And so he said that the worst thing you can do for an anxious child is to prepare the road for the child. What a parent should do is prepare the child for the road. And that's money. I mean, I try to just remember that every day when my kids complain about things. I'm trying to prepare you for the road versus I'm trying to just like cater this road to you.
Have you ever heard the saying, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and
Sure.
weak men create hard times?
Sure. Oh, interesting. Yeah, sure.
It seems like we're kind of like stuck somewhere in that cycle. You know what I mean? Because when times are great, like we're talking about, literally, people are living longer today. You have less threats to your actual human existence rather than the psychological threats that we see from these devices every single day. That often I feel like we have so much extra time to be exposed to these images that are outside of our human ability to be able to comprehend threat. Because back in the day, before Facebook and things popped up, we lived in global communities. We lived in local communities. Local communities were your neighborhood, the people here, people who you saw at the store. Then the advent of social media occurred and we start seeing things from all over the world every single day. It's very difficult for our mind to comprehend that global systematic impact of the community that we live in, although it's not even a threat to us because we're thousands and thousands of miles from some of these things that we see.
Sure. And again, that's, when you're just talking, if you just kind of carve out anxiety, anxiety is usually kind of anticipatory fear of a perceived threat or something. Or I think one of the main reasons that is up is because people are being exposed to I think humans were only supposed to be probably in community with like 12 to 15 people max. I think that's all we can handle. And so but now my daughter is also having to shoulder what's happening in Iraq and Iran, which again, there's a balance there, right? It's probably not great that I didn't even know that was a country until I was 8. Like that might not be good, but for her to feel some kind of ownership over that on a psychological level, I would say that's a net negative. And to your point, this is where parents, once kids are exposed to social media, we are no longer in between the social media and them. We're only in between the device and them. Once they have that device, that is just unfettered, just machine gun. And that is going to be absorbed into their brain through their individual temperament and psyche and style and their own maybe stuff and trauma. And, my youngest daughter, a lot of stuff would kind of just bounce right off of her from an anxiety perspective. She's just like, whatever. And my oldest daughter is just nothing but empath. So if she watched 8 minutes of CNN, I think she would have a nervous breakdown just because she'd empathize with every flood victim, every hurricane. She talks about the hurricanes. I'm like, honey, you just need to worry about, you have dance this afternoon and you have a little bit of homework to do tonight. Like I try to localize that a little bit, good, bad, or indifferent, but that feels like the better instinct.
And often there's the conversation as well. My girlfriend, the most empathetic person I've ever come across in my life. And part of our early discussions about her experience in growing up is she was always told that she was too emotional. She experienced things. She had too many feelings, and she started to kind of push those feelings down. And one of the things that I said to her was, your superpower is being able to experience your emotions. And as we get into this world where we say, we're exposed to everything, but you should still have a level head about what's happening. You shouldn't empathize for the stuff that's happening in the hurricane. I feel like even that is going the opposite direction because we need more empathetic people in our world today, but often they're shut down because of the hyper exposure that they have to all the things that are happening.
Yeah, it's tricky. Again, like I would never tell, my oldest daughter being an empath is the best. And I tell her, again, I love that she's a big feeler. It comes out in her art. It comes out in her dance. It comes out in her like goofiness. There's no doubt in my mind that she's going to do something with that gift. I think with anything, it's like, at what point does something control you versus you are harnessing it? And what point is something debilitating? And then I do think one of the things that this feels a little bit like old man on the porch stuff, but I think I do think we're lacking a little bit of perspective. This is where I think the kids sometimes, and especially in a modern privileged era, and again, not all kids in 2024 are privileged, but everybody should have some perspective. We lose some historical perspective on how well so many of us do have it. And I don't think that is good. So I think sometimes, again, so it's not, I don't want to minimize somebody's fear and anxiety, but as a therapist, one of the things I think that the therapy world has lost is like, I'm not paid to be somebody's friend. Actually, most of the time I am paid to tell them the truth that their friends won't tell them, which sometimes that truth is, listen, you actually need to be more worried about this thing than you think you do. Your trauma or your story is actually making you minimize the danger that this man has in your life, or you're minimizing domestic violence. We need to talk about that. But also I sometimes will have clients where it's, hey, you're maximizing this. You are catastrophizing this. And those are real conversations too, for different people at different times for different reasons. It's not a global blanket thing. But I think there's one of those that we as a society are way more comfortable having than the other. I do think right now we're kind of not allowed to tell anybody that their feelings are a little bit over exaggerated, because again, we're worried that that's how that's going to be perceived. But no, feelings are the best. I mean, I tell I think my daughter got that from me. I mean, I'm a therapist, and I'll watch a commercial and I will be moved to tears. Like, I'm easily moved. I'm an easily moved person, but I don't love fear. I don't love anxiety. I don't think those things are always great if they are, maximized all the time.
What do you think about the perspective of some people who often give a little bit of, I would say, criticism of spaces like mental health and therapy, often talk about therapists are often using their patient or their client base as kind of an annuity, right? We're going to keep you coming back for months and months and months and months and months and months and months. There's no undiagnosis plan here. It's just keep on coming, keep paying for your sessions, and we're not really going to make a lot of progress here. What do you say to those type of people?
They are my least favorite people professionally and personally, probably in the world, and it's, I think it's because I am in the work that, it's kind of like if you're, I don't know, if you're a plumber and you see a plumber doing just a terrible job, you're more pissed off about that because, hey, you represent all plumbers. What the heck are you doing? I feel so strongly about what you just said. Because again, I do feel like we all represent our team, our thing, whatever profession, if you're in media, podcast, like it or not, you're representing the thing. And if you're either the best of that thing or the worst of that thing, and everything has a narrative around it, both a positive and a negative, and you're either leaning one way or the other. And I think, unfortunately, that is a fair critique. I think most of the time people get the motivations wrong. I don't think the motivation is usually just like pure greed. I actually don't find a lot of greedy human services people. I think it's more incompetence and lack of training and lack of confidence to know. And then a little bit of that buying into what these parents bought into when they give their kid the 9th place trophy, which is like, oh, you can't actually do this without me. And now it's becoming bordering on a little bit of an ego thing. And also, well, what are you trying to say about your client? And what are you trying to say about you? And like, if I tried to unpack, so when I did supervision of other therapists, that's something I would hit on in a big way. It's like, hey, are you fostering dependence? Because you better not be fostering dependence. Like, and whether it's, consciously or subconsciously, that's one of the absolute, I think that is a cardinal sin of our work. And when I'd have some clients who felt like they were coming just to chat, I would say, seems like our time's up. This is awesome. And again, I understand why that's hard for clients, because they would sometimes say, oh, well, actually last week I had this happen. I'd say, awesome. Sounds like a Tuesday, call me when something real happens. And I guarantee you'll be able to handle, you got to push them away. My oldest actually, had a counselor that had some of that. And I really challenged that counselor to say, hey, what is our goal here? What is the goal? Again, you always hate to be that therapist who goes to another therapist, just like if you're a teacher who shows up to a parent teacher conference. But I needed to know, what is the goal of this? The goal is not a 12-year-long treatment plan. And the goal is not that my daughter thinks she needs to reach out to a professional for a little bit of a friend issue. Cause like, that's just life stuff. That's stuff that we as a family, we as a community, we as, her grandparents, her church. So yeah, man, I get fired up about that, but I don't think it's a profit motive. There's way easier ways to make profit. I think it's a little bit of just lack of good training, and then a little bit of an overinflated ego, and kind of a misplaced fear that, oh my God, what if something terrible happens and I'm not there? It's like, well, this person lived a long life before they came to you. They're going to live a long life after. If every therapist doesn't realize we are a temporary stop on this person's journey, then they probably need to do a lot more work on themselves.
I was having a conversation on the podcast with a brain surgeon with a PhD in neuroscience, and I asked him, what is the most important skill set a human being today can develop in themselves? And he said, emotional regulation. Because when we can't control our emotions, we can't control how we perceive a situation, information that comes to us, and our behavior in that moment is not going to be as grounded as it should be. What do you think about that skill set on the hierarchy, if you will, of emotional regulation? How important do you think that is for a person?
Oh, I think that's huge. And I usually call it like emotional intelligence. I think it's a similar, in a similar field where it's just like, yeah, we're life is nothing but unpredictable. Life is nothing but a series of curveballs. And yeah, maybe our curveballs now are smaller than they used to be, but they're still curveballs. Again, I'll take my daughter. She's in fourth grade, and when you're in fourth grade, it was funny. I remember like a year ago when I really realized, oh man, she's like a real person now. She used the word betrayed. She's like, one of my friends betrayed me, and I'm like, holy moly, that is a word. Okay, we're now entering this phase of life. You're using betrayed. Yeah, consciousness. Like, this is heavy. We're Shakespearean Netflix series level stuff. And so, yeah, life is just a constant series of ups and downs and challenges. And yeah, again,
how does that make you feel as a dad though, Matt? You know what I'm saying? A fourth grader is coming home and saying, Dad, someone betrayed me today. Do you have a little bit of a natural reaction to say, like, you're still a kid, don't get into this so quick?
Oh yeah. I think there's a protection side of me. There's part of me that kind of laughs because I'm probably a little histrionic sometimes, and I use dramatic language sometimes. And so I'm like, oh crap, I think she's my kid. So there's a little bit of ownership there. I probably did some of that when I was a kid. But yeah, again, so that's a strong initial feeling that she had. The skill is, all right, you still got to go knock out that test later. You still got to go and eat a good dinner. So, what I watch for her and amongst my kids and friends, and even again, people I work with, is what is your ability to pivot? What's your ability to, I think compartmentalize is usually framed as a negative. I don't necessarily view that as a negative. I view it as like your ability to take something, put it on a shelf, and then grab it back when you want to grab it back, I think is a superpower. Because otherwise, if you've got 50 jugs that are just spilling and smashing, and that's just, life is chaos. And that person, there's no way that person can be a great father, wife, husband, worker, leader, if just that's how your feelings are washing over you. So I do, now again, people who put it on the shelf and don't talk about it for 10 years, I think that's called suppression. But people who are able to, again, in that moment, hey, it's 4:00. I got to get on with Keenan and talk to him for a little bit. I'm going to put this up here and I'm going to pick that back up in an hour and a half. I do think I think anybody who's achieved any kind of success has probably mastered that to some degree.
I agree. I just know it's incredibly difficult. There's a really good book that I read, maybe early 2021, called Indistractable. Now, it's a book about the author's guy name is Neer, I believe. I don't remember what his last name is, but he was a engagement specialist for social media platforms like Facebook, Meta, Instagram, this type of stuff. And then he realized what he was doing in helping them gamify engagement was he was also having a super negative effect on people's ability to emotionally regulate themselves. And this is the analogy that he gave. He said, next time you go out into society, try and be an observer. If you see anybody who has a moment of discomfort, awkwardness, uncomfortability standing in line, doesn't know what to do with themselves, what do? They naturally pull out their device. And we've anchored this escapism of not wanting to deal with that emotion by going to our device hundreds of thousands, if yet millions of times. And so anytime when we feel like we need to get away, we automatically grab out our device. And he said, let's think about the long-term effects of this behavior being normalized. What's going to happen to the future of our society when everybody doesn't know how to deal with the emotion? They want to run away from everything in the instant of pulling out their phone and going into that digital world.
Yep. Yeah. And again, I think the different, what I always try to remind folks is, again, I don't think our instincts have changed that much, even over, centuries. I think our tools have changed. And again, the speed has changed. But I bet people who were living through ancient Rome also wanted to escape feeling, and they had their ways, and they had their, drinking wine at 7 a.m. and, but, like they had their ways of coping, and their good coping skills and their bad coping skills and their escapisms. We just certainly have so much more than we've ever had. And I do think there's something, again, with the eyes too, the eyes looking into this thing, like the eyes are kind of the window to the soul and to intimacy. There's something there, but that genie is so far out of the bottle that we really, truly do now have to just learn how to integrate it. I think people who purely fight against it, I respect them. I respect the hell out of it. Like if somebody can raise a modern family and they had 5 kids born in 2020 and those kids somehow don't have a phone until they're 25, like that's probably somebody I would just love to hang out with. But I don't think that's the mass. I don't think that's necessary. And again, now it's also, are those kids prepared for the modern tools? Or are they going to go out and, it's like, there was a day where people didn't drive. And then at some point people had to start preparing their kids for this giant death mobile that they had to learn how to harness. You had to learn how to harness this thing. Somehow we've harnessed cars pretty well. Better than we used to, right? I mean, there's less accidents probably from a percentage standpoint than we were driving around Model Ts. I'm hoping I'm always an optimist. I'm hoping something like that evolves with the social media where we actually learn how to harness this thing better. But we are in the middle of it. And we're at hopefully like the top of that bell curve of unhealthiness. And maybe it kind of, in your and my lifetime, it better come back down. Otherwise, we definitely lost.
I mean, I think we're kind of starting to see that. We see younger generations. Me specifically, I recognize the personal pressures that I was having put on me by things that were outside of my control. So I don't have Instagram, TikTok, or any social media on my phone. Yeah. And I'll tell you what, it's given me a lot more focus back to focus on the important stuff. One of the things that I love talking about on the podcast as well, Matt, is kind of our development in leadership. So I know you being a mental health professional often does not translate into being a COO of an organization that's doing tens of millions of dollars a year. How have you kind of grown into this role to be the leader, not the person who's giving face-to-face services to the clients? How has that been for you?
It took a while. I always tell people, I think I was a leader for about 7 years before I became a leader. I think before I really pivoted to acting like a leader, I think I had a leadership title for 7 years before I became a leader. I had some interesting early exposure, like I said, kind of in my youth ministry and young life days where people are like, hey, lead this random group of adults out to Romania. I wouldn't have called that leadership. I was just calling that like a sweet free ride to Romania. But when I look back, that was my first test of leading people and managing emotions and managing expectations and stuff. So, I think my skills in assessing people's needs, analyzing how they're feeling, analyzing how they're doing, analyzing where they can be pushed more than they think they can, my comfort level with discomfort and tough conversations, all of that stuff that made me a good therapist, 1,000% informs my leadership. I did have to, and then again, I think even just my analysis of systems, my ability to map onto like what's happening in this family system that's dysfunctional has helped me analyze what's happening in like a child welfare system, or like I can kind of quickly piece together, okay, these 5 things are driving these 4 things and these 3 solutions might stop and that's a very similar process to like treatment planning as a therapist. So some of those things, I don't know why. I think the main reason why people struggle to make that jump is actually just the discomfort with conflict and the discomfort with, I think in our field, in the mental health field, we do a disservice by creating a dichotomy between business and heart, and like making things that feel like they are mutually exclusive things, or success and mission or success. I just hate all of that stuff. I hate all of those either or things. And so I do think we kind of subconsciously train people that, well, you have to choose one of those paths or the other. And I had a couple leaders in my life that showed me that that's not the case. Or it's like, hey, you can be like a badass, successful person, provide for your family, and do the thing that I think you were put on this earth to do for people. And even flipping that more is like, hey, actually the leaders of this world should lean into that more. Like this kind of, I think this is probably sloppy language, but I identified this early that again, in our field, we kind of have this like obsession with martyrs and martyrdom stuff where it's like, we reward the person who looks like the most like bruised and broken warrior, like the social worker who works the longest hours gets the most high fives. And it's like, I don't think that's great. I don't think that's necessarily, it's like, hey, and it's almost like they wear it as a badge of honor of like, I worked 90 hours and I made 30K. It's like, dude, we need to talk about that. We need to talk about those 90 hours and that 30K. Now, again, I love what you're doing, but let's not do a badge of honor. Something is either broken systematically, because this is not good. And I think we've kind of rewarded that. And then we've scoffed at people who look like they're having business success or companies that are having business success and automatically assume they are less heart. Some of that's messy. And I try whatever I can. I try to blow all that up because I think it's all bullcrap.
What about if we were to go back to a younger version of Matt who was going to go down this leadership journey and impacting as many lives as he has? And if you could spend 5 private minutes with that younger version of yourself, what advice would you give to that younger version of you to navigate to get to where we're at here today?
Oh, yeah. Well, again, I absolutely did not plan on going into leadership. I really thought my career, I was convinced my career was going to be Goodwill Hunting. And I was going to be a therapist with a sweater and rocking a Robin Williams kind of haircut thing. And then teaching at a community college. Like that felt like deep into my 80s, that was going to be so, because I really did love doing the work and I actually loved teaching for a little bit. So like, I was like, that's what my life's going to be. And that's going to be an awesome life. And I got kind of thrust into leadership stuff. Just one day I showed up at one of my first jobs and our boss had disappeared. And our regional director came and said, hey, Matt, you seem enthusiastic. Do you mind taking over? And I said, yeah, as long as you don't mind, I don't know what I'm doing, I will be happy to do it. And I just kind of, the rest is just rocking and rolling. But again, for those first 5 to 7 years, I thought that the thing that made me a great individual contributor would make me a great leader. And it is a completely different skill set that I didn't master. I thought that just through enthusiasm and energy and role modeling that people would follow me, and people followed me, but they didn't charge up the hill with me. They went as far as I would go. But there's a couple companies there's one where I left and then I think things went south pretty quick. And I look back at that with a lot of regret and say, oh, you know what? I don't think I prepared a single person to be better than they were before I got there. I kind of just tried to like individually push this boulder up the hill because I probably was bad with conflict. I didn't want to ask people to do more. I didn't want to delegate. I would have saved 5 years of life and energy and maybe even some companies if I could go back and say, hey, listen, your job is no longer to just be you. Your job is to just get the most out of your team. That's all this is about. And that would have been a shock to me, but it would have helped me a lot.
There's an amazing quote I like to bring into these conversations sometimes by an author named Kevin Kelly. He says, you lead by letting others know what you expect of them, which may exceed what they expect of themselves. Provide them a reputation they can live up to. Oh,
nice. I love that. Yeah. One of my leaders did an exercise that it's cheesy, but it sticks out. And I've mentioned it a few times recently is he was in a room, there's a bunch of us, and he was our CEO. And he said, hey, I want everybody to raise your hand as high as you can. So everybody raises their hand. He goes, now everybody raise your hand just a little bit higher. And then everybody did. And he's like, so what the hell just happened there? And we were like, dang, okay. And he's like, listen, just naturally, you think as leaders, especially heart leaders, that all your people are giving everything that they got. Nobody is giving everything that they got by default. Like that is so exceptionally rare. And again, your job is to actually pull that extra 10, 15, 20%, know where that balance is. And again, I think it's just such a simple exercise where he literally said, raise it as high. He goes, I did say raise it high as I can, right? And now I just asked you to do more. Everybody was capable of doing more. I was like, I'll remember that. That's not bad.
I'm going to save that one. That
Yeah,
one's
that's not
beautiful.
bad. Yeah.
So the last thing I want to kind of talk about here is kind of, big baseball guy, Babe Ruth of classic. I like to use the analogy, standing at the plate, calling his shot. What is the shot that you're going to call over the next couple of years, Matt? How are we going to contribute to the community? What are we hoping for out there?
Ooh, that's a good. Are you a Ken Griffey Jr. guy?
Absolutely, man.
Okay.
Lefty.
All right. I think I have seen a shift, and this is a little bit specific to New Hope, but I think it's actually broader than just what we do. But I've seen a shift. Again, my world is adolescent and child mental health, right? I mean, so this is the world I think I'm going to be in until it's over. Is we've seen a shift in recognizing that family is everything. That family, even like insurance companies are starting to pay for family interventions and family services that even 10 years ago they would have never done, because and we're actually. There are services now that insurance will pay for kids as young as 1 or 2, and you don't have to have a kid that's got a diagnosis. So again, we're moving away from we're not pathologizing the kid, but we are recognizing that this family is probably more at risk because of 50 different factors that we can measure. And so let's get in as early. So I think we are shifting earlier and more family centered. And I think a lot of it, like a lot of people in like the private world that doesn't have to deal with insurance has been doing that for a long time because we can do whatever we want. But if we don't get the insurance industry and the payers and the whole apparatus on board, then systems don't change. And they're starting to get on board because they're seeing better returns for that. They're saying, oh, okay, if I pay for family therapy for $90 versus individual therapy for $70, the 90 is actually getting me a better return on investment because they only need 6 sessions as opposed to the 20 individual sessions. And so I think that is going to, I think in 20 years, that'll be the norm. And we will look back at this period from the 90s to the early 2020s where there was a mental health boom, but especially with kids, it was still focused on just working with the kid. And we were like, why would we waste so much of our time? And why do we actually in some ways kind of be anti-parent in a lot of cases? And I think there's a lot of therapists that look back and say, you know what, I spent a lot of time building relationships with kids as opposed to rebuilding relationships amongst families. And that was a miss. I think that's gonna be a great awakening though. I think that's gonna be a really good thing that I don't see that reversing. I think once we get over that hump, we're not gonna all of a sudden go back to, it's like certain medical evolutions. We're not going back to certain things from the 1910s, like with medically, like once you reach a new plateau, it's like, okay, we're here now, we're moving forward. I think in my space, family therapy and early intervention are going to become the norm, and we'll see some better outcomes because of it.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting back to first principles here, right? Treating the cause, not the symptom, which is really important. So, one of the traditions we have here on the podcast, Matt, as we put the wheels down to land this thing is our previous guest wanted to ask you a blind question. And we talked a little bit about this.
I love this, man. This is a sweet idea. Yeah.
So the question that came from our last guest was, what is the ROI on being a heart-centered leader?
Oh, that's a great way to frame that. I don't think I used the acronym ROI until like 3 years ago. So I think, again, this will be corny, but life is short. I believe you only get one of them. I think life should be lived to the max. And that I get really sad when I see people who feel like they have to go and do a job that they hate and then have fun on the weekends or enjoy something for like a fleeting hour on a Thursday night. It's like, I love every minute of my experience. Now, again, life is not always perfect, but because I get to lead, I'm the same person at work that I am at home because I'm living in a place that just lets me lead with my heart and my excitement, my enthusiasm, and my ability to be moved by people and constantly impressed by the resilience of human. It just makes life so much better, man. The ROI is that like, I have the same amount of fun at 11 a.m. in a staff meeting on Thursday than I do Saturday night at a Hornets game. In a lot of cases, maybe more fun because the Hornets are terrible. But like just generally because I just don't know how you could do it. I wouldn't want to compartmentalize that. I wouldn't want to compartmentalize 40 hours of my week as something that isn't meaningful or purposeful. And you don't have to be in this space to find meaning and purpose. I just hope everybody finds meaning and purpose in whatever the heck they're choosing to do for that much time of their life.
Well, Matt, I think that's a beautiful place for us to be able to put a bow on this. I just want to say thank you for everybody who's tuning in, watching, and listening today, Matt. You are the definition of Heart and Hustle, and I'm so glad you're able to join us on the show, man. I really appreciate it.
Oh, dude, Ken, this was awesome. Thanks for the opportunity, and I love the conversations you're having. So keep doing it.
And that's a wrap, guys. We'll catch you in the next one.